Hey, good morning. Welcome to Step 8 week, which is all about humility. But what does humility have to do with recovering from an addiction? That is the question. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today in this show. Thank you, High Five Live. This is episode 7 of Stepping Toward Christ, 12 Steps in 12 Weeks. I want to give a huge expression of gratitude and a shout out to my brothers Alema Harrington, who beautifully covered Step 5, and Brian Heaton, who articulately and powerfully covered Step 6. And if you were not able to watch those 2 episodes, you can check out the playlist on High Five Live of this show, Stepping Towards Christ. And you'll be able to go back and watch all of the weeks prior that lead up to this step. So if this is your first show tuning in, no worries. You can always go back and check it out. And I'll do a little review here. But thank you guys for all your help, Brian and Alema. And next week, we have another special guest. Taz Decker is going to be covering Step 8, which is the road to seeking forgiveness. So I want to thank Corey Andrews and the High Five Live team for allowing this show to air on High Five Live. Addiction is an ever-growing epidemic in all of its forms. And so if you struggle with drugs, alcohol, pornography, gambling, sugar addiction, compulsive overeating, love addiction, validation addiction, gaming, whatever, it all applies. So let me know where you guys are from. I'd love to see where you're watching from. And let's go ahead and dive in to Step 7. However, I can't talk about Step 7 without going back and covering the previous steps so that it puts it into context. All the steps require humility, but what does it have to do with recovery? Let me lead out by saying that I read a book that changed my life about 10 years ago, and it's called Aspire, Discovering Your Purpose Through the Power of Words by Kevin Hall. And in there, he has a whole chapter dedicated to humility, and he taught me the origin of the word. And humility comes from the Latin word humus. And humus means rich, dark, fertile soil. And when you plant a seed in dark, fertile soil, it gives it a place where it can grow. But if the soil is hard and crusty and there's no nutrients in it, you plant a seed there and the seed's going to die. And so that really helped me understand what humility is. Humility is not slumping your shoulders and putting yourself down or not accepting compliments, but it's more of a shoulder squaring principle of saying, I am one of God's children and I have greatness within me. However, that greatness can only shine forth if I ask for his help. And my will over here begins to align with God's will. And that's the process of the 12 steps, is coming together with alignment of our will as natural men and women to God's will to fulfill our purpose and his plan and to live a life of abundance, prosperity, and joy. So in step 1, we admit at that point that we can't change by ourselves. A lot of us have tried. And no matter what your chains of addiction are, those chains are very difficult to break by yourself. And getting that in step 1 is you're starting on the path. And then in step 2, so step 1 is I can't. Step 2 is he can. And that's coming to believe that God can be trusted. It's coming to believe that there is a power that can restore us to sanity and restore us to clarity of mind and restore us to pureness of heart and forgive us of all of our past wrongs And if we can come to believe in a power that loves us and that cares about us, rather than one that's disappointed in us and that doesn't want to hear from us, and one that is only judgmental and there's no love and grace and mercy, then it's really hard to trust that power, which is the next step. And step 3 is once we discover for ourselves who that power is, our loving Heavenly Father or Jesus Christ or any other form of higher power for you, then it's making that decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. And if we make that decision, because step 3 is just a decision, then we launch into step 4. And step 4 is where we go into the cave and we take a flashlight and we enter the cave of our past, and we're looking down in the dark caverns and in the deepest, darkest spots of our past, and we're illuminating light in there to become aware of what our patterns and what our behaviors are doing to others, as well as what are the causes and conditions that contribute to those behaviors. And by and large, they're driven by hundreds of forms of fear, as the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous describes. Fear creates a lot of forms of selfishness and self-seeking, and addiction is the disease of self-bondage. Of course, it's a mental illness as well, but I also believe and have experienced that those chains of selfishness, just the inability to think of other people's needs because it was all about me. For those of you that don't know, I suffered with addictions of all sorts for 10 years, and have been, on March 19th of this year, I will have achieved 10 years of sobriety, abstinence from drugs, alcohol, pornography, and been working on compulsive overeating, sugar addiction, flour addiction over the last 3.5 years. And I've been in recovery for that. And so there's truth to how these steps apply. So in step 4, we go in and we illuminate our past, and the disease dies in the daylight and the sickness grows in secret. So the idea is that we get really honest with ourselves. And then in step 5, we admit to God and to ourselves and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And it's not just only confession, but it's also talking about behavior patterns and things that we're going to try to work on after that point. Because it did no good for me to go into the bishop as a youth and just dump on him and leave his office and not change. And a bishop is the leader of my community church where I grew up, if you're unfamiliar with the term bishop. And my behaviors didn't change when I left his office. So I continued to go through that cycle, thinking that if I just confessed, I would be changed. But there's more to it, because this is about alignment of our will with God's will. And so in step 6, as Brian described, after we've admitted to ourselves and another human being and to God the exact nature of our wrongs in step 5, then in step 6, we become entirely ready to have God remove these character defects, to remove our behaviors that are blocking us off from the sunlight of the Spirit, to remove our selfishness, to remove our resentments, to remove our everything that blocks us off from His light and love and keeps us separate from others as well. So as we become entirely ready, that tees us up for what we're about to do in step 7. And step 7 is where we humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. So this is our offering. In the church organization that I belong to, Each week we partake of sacrament, bread and water. And each time I take the sacrament in recovery, I am working in honest and true steps 6 and 7. I review my week. I think about the things that I want to change, things that are not helping my spiritual progress, not helping my recovery, not family. They're getting in the way of my work and my relationships. And I will think about how I want to give those up and offer those up to God. And so in step 7, as I take that bread and the water, I literally think about offering all of those character defects up and those sins up, and ask God to remove them, each and every one of them, root and branch. And that ritual each week has been extremely powerful for my change. And I think a lot of times steps 6 and 7 get water skied across. And these principles are really what changes our nature. This is where we become more godlike. This is where we, if we're willing to change things that the world deems as normal, like lust, like greed, these character defects get in the way. Resentments. The world sometimes will pile on resentments. I mean, just watch the news. It's a feeding frenzy of resentments. And in recovery, we choose to not, we cease fighting everything and everyone. And we keep an open mind, and we stay true to ourselves, because we don't have the luxury of harboring resentments. We don't have the luxury of harboring fears. We don't have the luxury of harming others, because the moment that we're cut off from the sunlight of the Spirit with those character defects, we're at risk of relapse, and we're at risk of our behaviors, our old behaviors flaring back up. And for me, that means that I will die, because I've come this close to death from my addictions. And so as we really talk about step 7, this is the process where we offer that up. And my first step 7, my first honest step 7, what I did for step 6 is I wrote out a prayer to God, and I took all of the things I was most ashamed about. There were a lot. There was about 4 pages worth of, it was a 4-page letter to my Creator, or my Father in heaven. And the 2 things that were the most painful for me, that I was most ashamed about, were what I did to cause my divorce, and what I did to not be a fit father when my birth son came into the world, and then placing him for adoption. I just had a lot of shame around those things. And also the pain that I drug my parents, particularly my mom, through, and my siblings, and of course my dad, who's one of my best friends today. And those things I offered up, all of the shame, all of the guilt, and all of the behaviors attached to those wrongs that I caused them. And I offered all of those up to God to remove them, root and branch. And since that day, I have felt relatively free from the shame that I caused, or the shame that I carried by my actions. However, on a daily basis, I will review my day, and I will take an inventory, just as a reminder, look back on step 4, 5, and 6, and become aware of what's blocking us off from the sunlight of the Spirit today. Where was I resentful? Where was I inconsiderate? Where was I selfish? And what could I have done better? And then I write out a letter to my Father in heaven each and every night. I try to each and every night, but most nights I'm able to do it, and I remember to do it. And I offer up those character defects and those sins and those behaviors that I don't